Yes, we're looking at another issue about now. It's an issue that also involves future generations of Nigerians, and I want to believe that a lot of Nigerians will be interested in that. Just this week, I think the Debt Management Office came out to give new statistics about Nigeria's debt burden, which is raising eyebrows in many quarters, wondering if this debt which we are ratcheting up, is sustainable. The Debt Management Office did say that debt is now at 24.947 trillion naira as at March the 31st, 2019, from 24.387 trillion naira that's at December 31st, 2018. Now the debt had gone up by 2.3%. They gave a number of reasons for that. But we have with us in the studio an analyst to help us look at it. He is Ebere Onwundiwe, who is a retired professor of political science and economics. He's also the chairman of Analytics Research and Development Initiative. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much, Mabel.
Well, you have seen the figures. Do they alarm you? Are you worried about our ability to pay back as the IMF is?
Yes. I'm worried, especially about what you started your statement with, about the future generation, for whom this accumulation of debt will become a burden. And, but I also do, in many ways, understand that debt in and of itself is not a bad thing, because the most powerful economy in the world, the United States, has the heaviest debt. In our own country here, the most advanced state, Lagos, when you compare Lagos with the other states as well, also has heavy debt. And so the issue is not debt accumulation as it is whether you are getting those debts on yourself as a country or as a person and using it productively.
That's the main question. Now, I think a part of the factors we cited, which the DMO cited, could be responsible for this. They say it's an increase in domestic debt of states and the Federal Capital Territory. They also talked about a $2.5 billion Eurobond issued in February, which is being used to pay off maturing domestic debt. It's a little worrisome. I think before now we used to have a sinking fund where monies were set aside in the budget, in the budget, to pay back maturing debt instruments, obtained by the federal government. Now it seems we're issuing new bonds to pay off maturing debts. Are you worried about that?
Yes. Where you go to borrow the money is very important. And so for a country such as ours, which is developing, I think concessionary debt would be the best place to go. If you go so much to the commercial market, the lending conditions are more strident. They are more unfavorable. Interest rate is higher, and repayment period sometimes is more uncomfortable. So choosing the place to go is important. That's why these concessionary debts are better than commercial debts. But in the case of domestic borrowing, the only thing to be careful about is crowding out the private sector, because when the government becomes the chief borrower, there's very little room for commercial banks to extend loans that we need for development to our own entrepreneurs.
Indeed, that's why government says they're going out more to borrow because the rates are lower. And they also do not want, they want to create room for the private sector to borrow. What I'm asking, though, is the fact that we are now we're issuing new debts, it was saying, new instruments to pay off what has already matured. Does it show that we have the capacity to pay?
No, it doesn't show that we have the capacity to pay. Look, we could easily get into debt crisis And
but we're not there yet.
well, we are inching up there. If you have this, if a large proportion of your revenue goes into debt repayment, then you are actually inching very, very close to dangerous territory. And but what you're saying is exactly correct to worry about. I think we are at the margins of this situation, and we should be very, very careful in loading up on debt, because our debt service is almost, I've read some places, up to 60% now. And so that's reaching very unsustainable levels.
The DMO does say, though, that they are working on it, and they're structuring it in such a way that we don't get there. They keep saying that our debt to GDP ratio is sustainable, is around 17% or 18%, and we're still in safe territory. And they're also taking steps, especially in the domestic market, to ensure that, you know, we don't ratchet even more. I mean, they have brought up a warning for states. They made it more difficult for states to borrow or to issue instruments against their revenues, their projected revenues, because oil prices are dwindling. Do you think that the steps, though, have been steep enough to ensure that we're only borrowing for infrastructure, and that the monies that we borrow for infrastructure are used for just what we say we want to use it for?
Exactly. We should have borrowing that is targeted to projects. And in our negotiations for the loans, we should require that the payment for the loans will be from the projects that is sponsored by these monies that are borrowed. That's one. Second is that they are right to worry about the states, because the states do get away with murder. A lot of people have their eyes at the federal, but never look at the state governments and how they use the monies that have been borrowed, whether they have generated enough money from this borrowing in order to pay the loans. Number three is that DMO is not totally correct in, well, it's not the DMO per se, because they're a parastatal of the Ministry of Finance. So, but this whole idea of saying that we are still below the 25% the federal government says we should borrow when we use debt GDP ratio. But the problem is that that ratio is by itself wrong. GDP does not repay our loans. What repairs our loan is revenue. So debt revenue ratios should be more useful than GDP. Because what they're saying is, look, if you look at the source of our GDP, it is oil. All the other components of the structure of our GDP, like services, manufacturing, they are very huge on GDP, but oil contributes just about 10% or thereabout to our GDP. But it is the one, this 10% contributor to the GDP is the source of the revenue. So if you use GDP, where the other components don't contribute much to the revenue, you are actually telling lies with statistics. Because it doesn't make any sense to say that we are only 19% and we still have margin from 19 to 25%, 6% points away, so we're below that. That's lying to ourselves. You should look at the revenue itself and see what's coming.
That's an interesting perspective there. But we have to take a break at this moment. When we come back, I'll be asking you whether we can still borrow some more. I think it was sometime last year or this year that the former Minister of Power Works and Housing was talking about a 10 trillion naira infrastructure bond, something which some people thought was overly ambitious, or should we say realistic in the circumstances. We'll take your perspective on that when we come back. In just a moment, please stay with us. Nigeria still has an infrastructure deficit. So I think it was this year, with regards to the 2019 budget, the former Minister for Power Works and Housing, proposed, or said he would like to see a 10 trillion naira infrastructure plan. I want to ask our guests, can we borrow some more do you think that there's still room to borrow as much as 10 trillion naira?
Well, I don't think the room is there, given where we are now. But I think the necessity
yes.
May call for it. For instance, this issue, this point I made before about the relative contribution of other components of our GDP. Mm-hmm. You know, manufacturing is one of those, and services and so on. But manufacturing in particular, we are not doing a lot of exports of manufactured products. And the reason is that the infrastructure deficit we suffer in this country is not enabling our manufacturers to be very competitive abroad in selling their goods. And so I can understand where the minister is coming from, you know, but the point is, even if we take this bitter pill of borrowing more money, are we going to target it to that infrastructure? And if we to target it at infrastructure with economic decisions, not based on politics. The decisions that we have made so far about railway is very important. But are those decisions based on commercial considerations? The first thing we did is build Abuja Kano. What is the commercial value of Abuja Kano, for instance? And there are commercial corridors that will promote productivity in this country in the way that we are thinking, in the way that the minister himself is thinking, which are not prioritized. And so that's one point. So it all boils down to borrowing for what? And using it in a way that makes economic sense, to generate revenue that will help to pay for it and prepare our country for competition with the rest of the world.
That's certainly why the professionals must always be involved in these decisions. We have to thank you very much for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. Professor Ondiwe is a retired professor of political science and economics, and is also the chairman of O Analytics Research and Development Initiative. That's been the program this morning. It's definitely something to think about. I hope.
Well, yes, indeed. Thank you for watching as well. I'm Chamberlain Uso.
To have a wonderful weekend.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this program are those of the maker and do not reflect the views, opinions, and endorsement of Channels Television.